finalist in 2019. She speaks 3 languages. She's done several in-depth research projects, including travel to Hanoi, Buenos Aires, and Cape Town in support of one study. She's currently working at the Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Justice, where as a project manager, she's facilitated training for over 200 volunteers in support of a restorative justice campaign the center is sponsoring involving the Brooklyn community. She's had numerous study and work opportunities while she was going to school at UPenn, including 2 months at the Museum of Memories in Lima, Peru. She's worked with immigrant survivors of domestic abuse at the Nationality Service Center in Philadelphia. She's worked at the NAACP National Office in Baltimore. And in 2016, just for fun, she worked as an intern, a policy intern in the office of the mayor of the city of Charlotte. She's also volunteered extensively during her college years. And I was really impressed to hear that she's been accepted to the University of Oxford this coming fall to continue studying her restorative and transitional justice passions in their Masters of Philosophy program. And here's the deal. She's 23 years old. So I am so impressed with this young woman and everything that she has done. And I just can't say enough about her. That's really why we asked her to speak today and why I asked some of our guests to be here today, because I think she's a pretty special person. I do want to say that as an organization, she is exactly the kind of person we need to be focusing on for the future of Rotary. We talk about wanting to recruit younger people and diverse people and people who are champions, fostering new ideas and have a passion for the things that they are pursuing. I think Debbie Rabinovich is a person who fits that bill in every single way possible. So I have said enough. I am now going to turn it over to Debbie Rabinovich, who is
Wait, one more thing. She is
Jenny.
Also a past interactor. Yes,
I am sorry. She is a past interactor. And Jaya, I think she would be awesome to speak to your interactors. I'm going to go out on a limb and say she'd be willing to do it. But I think she would be an awesome speaker for your interactors because at 23 years of age, she's a role model for me. And I'm 64. So without any further ado, I've said enough. Debbie, I'm going to turn it over to you and go girl.
Kevin, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I just want to make sure my internet connection was being shaky at the beginning. Is it okay now? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I feel really lucky to be here, and it's such an incredible group. And like Kevin mentioned, I'm really interested in restorative justice, which is a word that some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not be. That's totally okay. And I want to share why that's important to me, kind of my own background in the field, and kind of how it's led me to the studies that I hope to do at Oxford. I'm going to share my screen so that I can show the slides that I've prepared. Let me just, sorry, 1 second. Here we go. All right, and let me full screen this. All right. So sometimes when I talk to people about restorative justice, they think that it's a hot topic because the term restorative justice right now is very, I think it's been called a buzzword. And some people think it's controversial, and we'll get into why that might be. But I want to start with something that I believe is completely uncontroversial, something that many of us could probably agree with, which is that there can be no understanding of the present or vision for the future without reckoning with the past. And in asking everyone to reckon with their own pasts and our past as a collective, I wanted to share a little bit about my past. Kevin gave an amazing introduction. Really, thank you. You made me sound so good. But when I think about how I would introduce myself to people who don't know me at all, I really think back to my ancestors and to my roots. These are my grandparents on both sides. These are my dad's parents on the left-hand side, and these are my mom's parents on the right-hand side. My dad's parents grew up in Argentina, and their ancestors were from the Ukraine. And their ancestors were from a village in the Ukraine called Kameniec-Podolski, which was the site of one of the largest massacres leading up to the Holocaust. And they escaped in the late 1800s when there was a series of pogroms, which were targeted violence towards Jews living in Eastern Europe. And that's when they moved to Argentina. And when they moved to Argentina, they made lives for themselves there. They integrated with their communities. And then after the dictatorship, or while the dictatorship was rising, they moved to Peru, which is where my dad was born. And these are my mom's parents. My grandpa, my Abu Pancho, grew up in Ancash, which is a mountain region of Peru. He is ethnically Quechua, so he's indigenous. His ancestry is indigenous. And this is my grandma, Abu Nelly, who grew up in Lima, and her ancestry is more mixed, but also largely indigenous. Her parents met on a hacienda, which was the Peruvian system of plantations, which wasn't abolished until 1969. And they were both indentured laborers there. And my grandfather, when he was 16, he moved by himself from Ancash to Lima because there was really bad economic struggles in the area where he had been growing up. So migration is really central to my ancestry. When I look at my family tree, I realize that not a single generation has stayed in the same place, and that's largely due to poverty, violence, or persecution. And these are my parents. My parents were both born and raised in Peru, and they met in college there. They met in college in the early 80s. And when they started college, they had no idea that violent political conflict would break out in Peru. Just as they were beginning their studies, there was a conflict that really escalated between terrorist groups and the state. And indigenous people and students were often caught in the crossfire. Both the state and terrorist groups targeted indigenous communities, like the ones that my grandfather came from, and students on college campuses as targets for violence. And so my parents were studying chemistry, both of them, during that time, and it was impossible to study. Imagine power outages all the time while you're trying to work in the lab, and going to school with curfews constantly. So my parents decided that they would apply to grad school in the US, and they would work to finish undergrad and start grad school in the US. And they were really lucky to get student visas, and they came here in the late 80s, in 1989. So like I said before, migration has been really central to my family's history. And that's why in college I became really interested and involved with immigrant rights activism. When I was in college at Penn, I became especially interested in Know Your Rights activism. Know Your Rights is a movement that focuses on teaching people what their rights are. I think we've seen many cases in which immigrants who are detained, who may have language barriers, don't know how to say, I have the right to remain silent, things that we maybe know from watching TV or just growing up in American culture. And so I became really involved in Know Your Rights, and I did a study for my honors thesis where I studied the impact of Know Your Rights workshops. And this gave me a huge sense of hope because all of the people who I was interviewing were also my clients at the Nationality Service Center, where, as Kevin mentioned, I was working with immigrant survivors of domestic violence who were especially vulnerable to infringement on their rights and safety concerns. And so all of the participants who I interviewed who had been through Know Your Rights workshops had this sense of empowerment and legal knowledge. And it really changed not just the way that they interacted with law enforcement, the way they interacted with their communities, but their perception of themselves. It gave a lot of my clients a sense of social citizenship. So they would say things like, now that I know my rights, I feel more American, even though they were in asylum proceedings and in visa proceedings. So I thought it was a really powerful movement. And right after I submitted my thesis, it was the summer of 2019, and it seems forever ago, a year ago, really, so much has happened in a year, but things really started to escalate in the realm of immigrant issues. That was the summer that people were starting to be put in detention camps along the southern border. And that was the summer that the terrible conditions were really brought to light. And that was also the summer when family separation escalated. And suddenly I lost faith in my thesis. I felt so frustrated with this system where I thought knowing your rights really meant something. And I found myself wondering, what does knowing your rights matter if your rights are going to be violated regardless? We've seen immigrants held in detention centers far longer than the legal limit of 72 hours. And we've seen treatment in those detention centers go from being the same treatment that incarcerated people receive in jail, which is already bad enough, to conditions of absolute desperation where there are constant health concerns, especially in light of COVID-19. So I wondered, how can we move from triaging this migration crisis where the system is completely overwhelmed and constantly failing people who it's supposed to be helping, to remedying trauma caused by a broken system? When I was working at the Nationality Service Center, which was the immigrant agency in Philadelphia, I saw so much of this trauma firsthand. The majority of my clients had been through detention centers, and they had serious psychological issues coming back from that, not to mention the trauma of domestic violence, which they had all experienced. They had constant separation anxiety. I remember a big part of my job was helping mothers enroll their children in school, and their kids were just terrified to go to school because they were scared that they would come back home and their parents wouldn't be there, that they would be separated, because they had already experienced that. And so I saw the way that the center I was working at was really able to change some of those dynamics. We provided comprehensive social services, including mental health care, physical health. So we were making sure that clients were able to receive medical attention, and also just overall social and legal aid. And so I saw the way that the organization I was working at was able to meet needs, but then I realized that the system was so much bigger than one organization in Philadelphia. We were really acting as a safety net. We were part of that triage system, but it would take serious systemic change to be able to address all of the trauma that the state has inflicted on migrants and on other communities over the last several years. So that's where restorative justice comes in. I want to give you all a brief definition of restorative justice. Traditionally, restorative justice has been focused in the realm of criminal justice, and it's been on a more individual level. So it focuses on helping former inmates reintegrate into the community at large. There are several strategies through which this happens, including mediation and dialogue, community service, and rehabilitation therapies. but basically restorative justice for a long time in the United States was a way that we could give formerly incarcerated people or soon to be incarcerated people an alternative to punitive justice, an alternative way to reconcile the actions of their past. And this is the root of restorative justice in the United States, but this is a more individual level of what I'm talking about. Restorative justice on the state level takes that idea of reconciliation and expands it. And restorative justice on the state level includes interventions enacted in order to redress legacies of human rights abuses. And there's a long history of restorative justice on the state level. Outside of the US, this has been called transitional justice, and it's happened in countries where they're undergoing a democratic transition. That's where the name transitional comes from in other countries. So countries where this has happened has been Peru after the state conflict that led to my parents' immigration. There was a huge truth and reconciliation process, and that process changed the government. It included survivor testimonies, and through that process, the Museum of Memory in Lima, Peru was born. And I was lucky enough to work there this past summer, a year ago, translating survivor testimonies that really changed the way that public discourse around that conflict works. It really brought to light the narratives of Indigenous people who were targets of state and terrorist violence, and was able to create a process for processing claims for people whose livelihoods had been taken away from them through the conflict. Of course, a key example of restorative and transitional justice also happened in Germany after the Holocaust, when the state gave reparations, not just to the world through state level policies, but also to individual Holocaust survivors. And another example is in South Africa. I was lucky to also study in Cape Town during my semester abroad. And after apartheid, there were a series of truth and reconciliation commissions and investigations into perpetrators of the apartheid policies and regime. And these processes helped all of these countries, and many more that have undergone similar processes, reconcile with their past to create a better future. And to me, it's interesting that in the US, we don't call it transitional justice. In the US, we consider ourselves a consolidated democracy, an established democracy. And so how could we possibly undergo a process of transitional justice? What would we be transitioning from, and what would we be transitioning to? This is a big question that's, I think, lingering when we think of restorative and transitional justice in the United States. And the interventions would be the same. They would include reparations, truth commissions, and institutional reforms. In all my research so far, I found that there are two huge barriers to redressing human rights violations in the state. First, this idea that the US is exceptional. I think that my whole life I've heard this narrative that the US has a higher purpose, and that the US has accomplished something different than the rest of the world. And I think that the US has that idealism that is so beautiful, but that idea of exceptionalism actually prevents us from reconciling with our past. We think, this country is called to something so much higher, we couldn't possibly have human rights abuses, which is a reason we talk about civil rights in the US. We don't talk about human rights here, we talk about civil rights, because in some way we conceptualize ourselves as different than the rest of the world, which has to be concerned with questions of human rights. And then there's also this misconception about the idealism of restorative justice. Like I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, so many people I've talked to about restorative justice have said, that's great, that's wonderful, I don't disagree with you, but it would never happen here. And to me, these two misconceptions are so counterintuitive. How can we be an exceptional country and yet reject idealism without even trying it? This to me is really perplexing. And part of the reason it's so perplexing is because both are wrong. And I want to give you a few examples. First, I want to preface the examples with saying that restorative justice is the only alternative to forgetting, to perpetuating trauma, and to repeating history. And the examples that I'm about to show you show both ways that history has been repeated, and ways that the US is perhaps not as exceptional as we hope it could be. And there are also examples in which restorative justice has been enacted. So I'm about to show a few photos just as a, I guess, content warning of both migrant detention and the displacement of people. So the first photos I wanted to show are photos that compare Japanese internment to migrant detention. And this is the question that I think drew me into the field of restorative justice. So to me, these photos were jarring. They're so similar in so many ways, and it seems like we have repeated history, and not just in a one-to-one fashion, but history has repeated itself worse than before. This manifestation of detention is so much more callous than one in which people were not separated from their families. And that's not to diminish the trauma of Japanese internment at all, but it seems that in forgetting the violence of Japanese internment, the US allowed itself to stoop perhaps even lower in its treatment of Central American migrants. Here's another photo of the same phenomenon that I thought was very jarring. Here's another example, and this is moving to my current work. So I'm currently a project manager at the Stan Greenspan Center for Peace and Social Justice, and my work revolves around the community of Brooklyn. And I didn't delve into that too much yet because Kevin and Jenny shared with me that you all have heard a little bit about Brooklyn. And I think it's becoming a bigger conversation in the Charlotte community. Brooklyn was a community in Second Ward, an affluent Black community that was displaced through urban renewal. And displacement is really kind of a gross euphemism because urban renewal was a national trend in urban planning. I was an urban studies major in college, so I studied this at length, and urban renewal basically took desirable land that belonged to Black communities, and it evicted those Black communities through policies of eminent domain, and it completely decimated livelihoods. In Brooklyn, in Charlotte, there were 12 Black churches, all of which were destroyed. There was a hospital funded by the Black community, and that hospital stood where the Panther Stadium now stands. There were schools and libraries, and those were destroyed, and over their remains was built the courthouse and the jail, locations where mass incarceration is enacted in Charlotte today. And so the history of Brooklyn is both traumatic to within the scope of the history of Charlotte, and also pretty near. You know, it was from 1960 to 1970, 75 at the latest. That was not long ago. So this is really perhaps not as fresh of a wound as these migration issues, but it's continuous, and I think it's never healed. And that's something that I've learned in my work. So much of my own work at the center over the last year has involved leading community workshops and leading listening sessions. And leading listening sessions with former residents of Brooklyn has really brought that trauma to light. So much of the work I've done in those meetings has revolved around how do you heal from trauma? And it was so interesting putting back into practice some of what I would talk to my clients who had faced domestic violence about. I would talk to my clients about this cycle of trauma. How do you heal? How do you reconcile? And I found myself using that same skill set and that same language to talk to people who were displaced from their neighborhoods, because at the end of the day, it's another kind of violence. And so all of that is to say, the two pictures that I'm showing on this slide are a photo of, or not a photo, a portion of the Indian Removal Act of 1933, no, of 1875, excuse me, which was the impetus for the forced removal of Native Americans from their land in the eastern United States and their expulsion to the West. And the parallel between this and 100 years later, the forced removal of residents of Brooklyn, to me was so jarring. And I think it's kind of a shocking comparison. It doesn't come to light, but this act of displacement of removal has repeated itself on the same soil 100 years later. So here's another image. This is a painting of the Trail of Tears, which I think is probably familiar for many, and also an image of residents of Brooklyn, young boys who were viewing the destruction of their own community. So these are the ways that history has repeated itself, and I hope it dispels a little bit of that American exceptionalism. And I'm not saying that because I don't think America could be exceptional or could be what we hope it is or was, but rather because I think we have to be honest with our past to reconcile it and move forward. And I also want to give two examples related to the history that I showed of real restorative justice that has happened in US history. First, the Indian Claims Commission of 1946 heard historic grievances regarding this forced displacement. And through these grievance commissions that were established through the Indian Claims Commission, it awarded $1.3 billion to 176 tribes. So this was a federal program that lasted, it ended up lasting the better part of a decade. And through this process, tribes were able to share their stories of displacement and receive recompense for the displacement that they experienced. The US Civil Liberties Act of 1980, which happened 10 years after, which happened after 10 years of constant campaigning from the Japanese community, redressed Japanese internment during World War II. And it granted individual internees up to $20,000 in reparations. So when people say to me that reparations are impossible or that truth and reconciliation commissions wouldn't work in the US, these are the two policies I think of. These were expansive federal policies that resulted in tangible needs met for the community. They weren't perfect in any sense of the word. Concessions were absolutely made. For example, related to my own, I guess, roots, there were Peruvian Japanese internees held in detention who were basically extradited to the US on the basis of being Japanese from Peru, and they weren't granted any reparations through the US Civil Liberties Act because they weren't US citizens. And so one thing that interests me personally about both of these policies is understanding how they were passed. A huge issue that we've come across in my current work in restorative justice regarding Brooklyn is, how do we go from saying we need restorative justice to receiving social programs, to actually having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to receiving land grants? These are all examples. None of them are concrete yet because we fundamentally have a lack of understanding about the process. How do we get from point A to point B? So in my master's program next year at Oxford, I'll be studying these two policies at length, and I'll be studying the discursive, legislative, and litigative strategies that advocates used to get them passed. So I want to understand how they did it and use my takeaways and my findings from the study that I'm going to conduct to bring back tangible strategies for people interested in enacting restorative justice back here at home. Restorative justice is not only possible, it's necessary. I think it's the only way to reconcile some of the violence of our past and some of the violence of our present to build a future in which everyone can be integrated into this melting pot that we claim that America is. I don't believe in restorative justice because I have a negative view of America. I believe in it because I have hope that America will live up to the values that it claims to have. And I think that that's necessary. It's the only way to stay sane in a climate when things seem so fraught and so impossible. So I hope that this helped share, I guess, the meaning of restorative justice with this club and with everyone here. And I appreciate you all listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know.
Debbie, thank you so much for what you have shared with us. I am going to open this up for questions now. Excuse me, I was responding to a chat, but if anyone has any questions, let me say, first of all, this was a compelling presentation. You've really helped me to understand some things that I think I kind of thought or knew about, but you've really made things a lot clearer for me. I think one of the things in any speech or any presentation I hear, I want to hear things that make me ask questions and to make me think about things. You have certainly made me think about things, and I am very appreciative of that. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Hi, Susan.
Hey, I just wanted to say, wow, that was awesome. It was extremely informative and impressive. I'm processing what I wish I had, videoed or something so that I could replay this, because I feel that what you talked about was rich and full of things that are so relevant to where we wake up this morning and what's happening in our country. And so I thank you for bringing a historical context and a future vision that we can all long for. And so I thank you for that hope that you brought us today. And I just want to tell you, I'm extremely impressed and appreciative that I was invited to listen this morning. So thank you.
I'm gonna jump in here and say, and Debbie, we did this completely without your permission. I hope you're okay with it, but I think Jenny is recording this.
Yes.
And I hope that's okay with you, because we wanted to memorialize this. I think it has value beyond this meeting. I have a suspicion you're going to be asked to speak at other events, but we'll let you know about all of those things. Susan is our county commissioner for District 6, and thank you, Susan, for those remarks. I know, Jennifer, I
wanted to ask a question. Thank you so much, Debbie. I'm really grateful for your presentation, and I had to cut out for a few minutes while my daughter had to get on a quick call, and then I came back, so I missed a brief part of it. I'm glad it's being recorded. I guess the question that I wanted to ask is, well, first of all, let me say, I think it's really important that you're going to study how other folks did it and looking at policy, right? And trying to understand that, because I think that's, lacking and needed, and definitely an area of focus for us all. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how controlling the narrative plays into what we're dealing with, because it's really easy for folks to, look to the Japanese internment camp, for example, and say, oh, that was clearly wrong. They shouldn't have just rounded them up. But the people in Central America should just stay home and fight for their rights in their own country, with no, in my view, no recognition of how in many of those countries it's a police state, it's a violent police state, with no recognition about the United States military and financial interventions into those countries and how that has played out. with little recognition that many of these people are indigenous. It's actually their land, you know, that, and they're migrating on their original land. And so it's really easy for a talking point to be out there and say, oh, well, they just shouldn't come. And people kind of shut down. The talking points, those are just 3, and I probably could add on 7 more, and you could too, I'm sure. It's such a much more complex way to view it because it is a complex subject. How have you thought about studying, or do you have any thoughts on how we can best control the narrative or put forth a narrative that's succinct, which is obviously what I'm doing because I'm carrying on, but succinct and gets to the heart of the matter and makes it not so complicated, but that can compete with the short sound bites that often shut the conversation down?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think 2 things come to mind. First is, you're right. Part of what draws me to restorative justice is that it's such a big part of my history. When I think about restorative justice, I realize that restorative justice has been necessary in every single place that my family has migrated from. It has been central to restabilizing places that have gone through serious conflict. What seems rare is that, I mean, restorative justice is so often necessary in places where migration is also necessary. What seems wild is that restorative justice is also so necessary in places where people migrate to, namely the US. So in that way, the US case is exceptional, which I think is part of the reason why transitional justice and restorative justice studies globally don't necessarily apply to the US. This context is so different. The way that we conceive of ourselves and conceive of others is so different. And that's why I really want to study these 2 specific policies. And when I talk about these are such academic jargony terms, discursive, legislative, and litigative strategies. What I mean by discursive strategies is really this idea of controlling the narrative. So in implementing restorative justice, one thing I always think about is the large part that art plays in making restorative justice possible. I'll give you an example that's more contemporary.
Can I call you back in a few minutes?
In the US currently, Brian Stevenson has launched something called the National Lynching Memorial. I don't know if you all have heard of it.
I've been there. I took my kids to visit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but so for those of you who don't know, the National Lynching Memorial memorializes lynching in a way that's very visceral and tangible. There are jars of soil collected from trees where lynchings occurred, and it makes, for people who don't know that history or didn't live that history, it makes it much more clear. And so I think that the museum I worked at in Peru functioned in a very similar way. It used art to shift the narrative and really make an experience that seems distant much closer. And so I think that you're right, controlling the narrative is really important, and how we do that is a huge question. But I think that one thing that isn't working is echo chambers and yelling back and forth at each other. I think that you're right, there are people who just want to shut down the conversation, but it's really hard to shut down art or to shut down broader public discourse. So I part of what I want to study is how do people shift that narrative, change the narrative, and really bring to light stories. I think stories are really central, that bring public opinion to their side. I think that's always central to implementing restorative justice, for sure.
Kevin, do you mind?
Good luck to you.
Kevin, do you mind if I chime in here?
Oh, please.
Thank you. Hey, everybody, I'm Lee Altman. One small correction, I'm not a county commissioner yet. I'm still a candidate, but I hope to sail through in November and be sworn in December. But I did want to correct that.
Thank you, Lee.
No, thank you. And thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to thank Deborah so much. it was an incredible presentation. On a personal note, my family also fled anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. And it's so interesting to see the different paths that the diaspora took across the world, and to hear about the way it manifested in South America. And I just found that really interesting, and I'm so excited to get to virtually meet you. There's been so much this week at the county level, just, you know, talking about social issues. We see across our nation, you know, so much violence and suffering. Our communities being torn apart by so many different forms of vestiges of racism, and that continue today. And I think that your focus on Brooklyn is just, it's just ever more timely, because I think if you took a poll of Mecklenburg County residents and asked them what Brooklyn is and what its implications are to the African American community in Mecklenburg County, and we talk about I heard the county talking this week about outcomes for our students. The story of Brooklyn is so important to understanding why we have the problems that we have today, why we continue to struggle the way we do. And, you know, it's certainly a maxim that we Jews talk about, but it's true for all of us, that to not understand our history is to repeat it. So I just commend you for the social justice work that you're doing. And I'm so grateful for the role that you're going to play in helping us to bring this community to a more holistic place that really accounts for our past. So thank you so much for the opportunity this morning.
Thank you.
Quanta has a question.
Quanta, yes.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I really applaud you and appreciate your efforts in bringing the past. It's what I call social archaeology. I was wondering what other efforts to compensate for the past so that the future will look better in terms of racial relations and poverty. Is there anything that is included in your program and in your research? Thank you. I don't know if I was making my question clear. If there is something that's not clear, please let me know.
Just a point of clarification, you mean other policies that I want to study, or?
What I see is that, you know, there is so much effort to bring the darkness of the past. So then what can we do to make the future brighter? So there is a balance in there, then, rather than just becoming hopeless and concentrating on the darkness of the past, we can also do some things to build a brighter future for future generations.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I think about a lot is that in school, I think I learned about Japanese internment for 5 minutes over the course of 13 years in the public school system. I think that the way that we learn about our country's trauma is so related to the way that we wish it were better. And we think that by erasing this past, in pretending it never happened, we can kind of pretend we're the country that we hope we could be, if that makes sense. And I think that something that would powerfully change that would be if we would not only learn about the trauma of our past, but also learn about ways in which that was reconciled. So I think every student in school.
Oh, I think we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, that's better.
So every student should learn not just about Japanese internment, but also about the US Civil Liberties Act. People should know that reconciliation and serious reckoning with our past is possible, and that those outcomes are significant. And so obviously Japanese internment decimated Japanese livelihoods during the war and post-war period. But when individual internees were granted $20,000 in reparations, that was able to rebuild livelihoods in a way that matters. And there are economic impact studies that show that those reparations payments prevented generational cycles of poverty from happening, cycles that we see in the African-American community that has never received reparations and has never received a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's been a bill, HR 40, sitting in the House for decades, waiting, and this bill seeks to investigate the impact of slavery. It's not a bill to propose reparations. It's not a bill to enact specific policy. It's an exploratory bill to bring to light the generational impact of slavery.
Hey, Debbie, you're fading out again.
Oh no, oh, I'm sorry.
You're good.
Over here, so the internet, the rain, I'm sorry, but
No worries.
I hope that makes sense. I think that my research and my studies can contribute to this burgeoning field of bringing to light what the possibilities are. I think if we don't even know our history, it's impossible to know that reparations and truth and reconciliation are part of that history. And if we know that, then we're able to see that for the future.
Any other questions? Barbara Horstman.
Wait, let me find you, Barbara. Oh,
and enlightening.
Start over. I'm sorry, I had you muted.
Okay. Deborah has given such an enlightening presentation because I watched the series about, there were 3 episodes on what happened to Asians during World War II and afterwards and how they were mistreated. And I've also been very interested in actually when Esela was studying American history, I watched some videos that her instructor had given them on the restoration after the Civil War, and what it brought forward to me was that we have never reconciled the feelings from the Civil War in this country, and that there's been an attitude, much not among the people in our group probably, but among white people in general, that we could have the woman who attacks the African-American man who's a college level instructor, and she attacks him for him telling her to leash her dog. And the idea that white people have had their foot on the necks of African Americans since the Civil War, because we have put into place all kinds of laws that haven't allowed and never allowed African Americans or brown-skinned people to go beyond low-level jobs, to live where they wanted to live, to have all the liberties that we experience normally, as you know, that I experienced all my life. And my mom worked in a factory and all that, and she worked her way up. But had she been African American, I'm certain that I wouldn't have the opportunities that I had, even with a mom that worked so hard. So anyway, I just express my full support to Deborah and her studies, and I pray that we could all influence others to really see these issues more clearly, and that we could all begin restoring our relationship with every other individual, whether they're dark skin, light skin, whatever type of skin they've got. We've got to renew our efforts to be inclusive and embrace each other as one human being, one common humanity, not all these individual pigeonholes we put people into.
Barbara, you have now officially been designated the spokesperson for the Charlotte Dilworth South End Rotary Club. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions, comments? I think in the interest of time, I again want to thank you, Debbie, for taking the time to be with us today. We've gone a little bit longer than normal, but you caused that to happen with such an interesting and compelling presentation. On behalf of the Charlotte Dilworth South End Rotary Club, we thank you. I want to thank all of the guests for being here today. And I really, really appreciate this. Debbie, I'm sure you're going to be hearing from others, and we will definitely be staying in touch with you. So with that in mind,